Okay, today, Pride in Surrey, we are speaking to somebody who really needs no introduction. We're speaking to the campaigning legend that is Peter Tatchell. Thank you for joining us, Peter. We really appreciate it.
Very, very honoured to join you.
It's an honour for us. So really, we wanted to speak to you a little bit about World AIDS Day. World AIDS Day was founded in 1988 and it was the first ever global health day. What does World AIDS Day mean to you personally?
World AIDS Day for me is an occasion to pause and remember those we have lost, and to remember the stupendous campaigns that people undertook to ensure that people with HIV and AIDS got support and care. To also remember those campaigns to ensure that education about preventing HIV was rolled out, including in schools. It's also, of course, a reminder that the HIV pandemic isn't over yet. Although the numbers of new infections has not escalated in the way it did in the past, and in fact among gay and bisexual men has come down, globally in particular, there is still a major health emergency with millions of people infected and many people dying unnecessarily because they cannot access the life-saving drugs. So it's a combination of all those things.
Do you feel it's useful in terms of raising awareness and I suppose sort of wider acceptance of the community who are living with HIV and AIDS?
I think having a day for a particular issue is always helpful. We've just had Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is a timely reminder about the horrendous scale of transphobic violence and assaults that happen around the world. Likewise with World AIDS Day, it's the one day when media and NGOs and community groups pause to focus on this one issue. And I think it's really an issue that should be focused on 24/7, 365 days a year. But to have one day, it is important and significant.
You mentioned schools just a moment ago, and it's something that we've been very vocal about here in Surrey in terms of sexual health education for young people and how lacking it is, particularly for young people who are LGBTQ+. Do you feel that that schools need to really focus on that? I read a very worrying statistic that something like 42% of people don't actually know how HIV is transmitted, and that I'm not sure of the accuracy of it, but the message is clear that there is some confusion, and that's perhaps due in part to how things have progressed. But how do you feel that we as a society can sort of continue to push the sexual health agenda?
Well, you are right. Although it's true that schools are required to teach about HIV and AIDS, the level and quality of that teaching is very random and very up and down. It depends on which school, which area, and so on. And of course, faith schools are often the worst at doing this. So the actual quality of that education is mostly not good enough. There are some schools who do it really well, and those teachers deserve commendation and praise. But a lot of schools, it's just a perfunctory mention in passing, maybe part of a lesson once a year or something, which is not good enough, because things like negotiating safer sex, understanding the routes of transmission, knowing about PrEP and PEP, these kind of things, that's not getting to a lot of school kids. And even in higher education, in universities, it's not being done well enough. So there is no reason to be complacent or to pat ourselves on the back. We have done lots of good things, and I suppose we do deserve some praise, but there is much more work to do.
Agree with you more.
Yeah. Peter, you famously wrote the book AIDS, A Guide to Survival, recognised as the first comprehensive guide to people living with HIV and AIDS. Can you tell us a little bit about how that book was received at the time of publication?
Well, of course, this was back in the mid-1980s, and the prevailing view in those eras was that HIV was a death sentence, that there was no option but to just curl up and, you know, wait for your death, and a very painful, distressing, prolonged death that was. I looked at models of patients with cancer who had used you know, various strategies and methods to try and reduce the severity of their cancer, to prolong their survival times, and so on. And I calculated that a similar strategy or set of ideas could be used for people with HIV. I wasn't pretending for a moment that it could be cured or that their lives could necessarily be saved. But the evidence from cancer patients was if you took certain steps, that you could slow the progression of the cancer, reduce the side effects and symptoms, and, you know, extend your lifespan by some considerable time. So that's what that book was really all about, was to try and give people with HIV and AIDS hope at a time when there, you know, no one else really was. And I found that very, very depressing. You know, I thought, you know, people with this horrendous virus, including my own friends, people I knew, they needed hope, and they needed to know that, you know, there were things they could do that would improve the quality of their life and indeed the quality of their death.
How do you think that book would be received if it were released today as a, you know, as a new publication?
Well, of course, it's not really so relevant now because we do have a range of anti-HIV therapies that can, you know, basically make HIV a manageable condition. So while it's true, you know, all of us can do things to boost our immune system, you know, a good diet, you know, a positive mental attitude, keeping fit. There are lots of kinds of things you can do, which will help us all. And that still is relevant to people with HIV and AIDS. But the really crucial thing is, of course, today that we do have a treatment that can make it a manageable condition, which we didn't have back then. You know, there was no treatment at all. And, you know, it left people with HIV and AIDS in a very, very despondent condition.
What, if any, changes do you feel that there have been for people living with HIV and AIDS today compared to back in the 80s?
Well, the crucial thing is, of course, the fact that treatments are available, so that people with HIV and AIDS don't die. In fact, people with HIV can now live normal lifespans, you know, taking the medication, like, you know, people with, you know, diabetes, you know, take insulin. You know, it's no longer the death sentence. That's the major thing. But of course, I think there has been a major improvement in public understanding. It's still not perfect, that's true, but, you know, back then HIV was deemed, quote, the gay plague, which will kill us all, according to the Daily Express and other newspapers' headlines in the mid-1980s. There was incredible prejudice. I can remember friends of mine who were gay were refused service in their local pub. Another case of a gay couple down in Surrey who were told to go home and bring their own glasses if they wanted to get a drink. There were cases where gay people were facing trials in courts, and they were ordered to dress head to toe in hazard suits and goggles and glasses. And in one particular very well publicized case, the judge ordered that when the defendant was released from the dock, that he be taken out and that his hazard suit be incinerated at, quote, the highest possible temperature. There were also instances where we had politicians who were demanding that people with HIV and even LGBT plus people who were deemed to be a risk group at the time, or a particular risk group, that we should be quarantined. There's a famous case of a conservative politician who said that people with HIV should be gassed. I mean, this is really extraordinary looking back on it. So public attitudes are much more sympathetic and understanding today compared to back then. But
Yeah.
there is always still room for improvement. And as you mentioned, there are still substantive levels of ignorance.
Do you think that fear and that ignorance was exacerbated by the infamous advertising campaign, those terrifying adverts that went out? Do you think that they had a hugely, profoundly negative impact?
Yeah, the tombstone adverts
Yes.
put out by the Conservative government in the mid-1980s were very scary. And of course, the rationale was that they needed to make it scary in order to get people to sit up and take notice and to take precautions. But I think, you know, sometimes making people terrified can actually disempower them. And, you know, there could have been more emphasis on supporting and caring for people with HIV, which there wasn't in the early days. There could have been more emphasis on safer sex, although there was mention in passing about using a condom. You know, you have to be a bit more specific than that, and you have to give people a stronger sense. I would say that one of the extraordinary achievements of the LGBT plus community, who really spearheaded the fight against HIV in the early days, was to devise the idea of safer sex. And that has undoubtedly saved millions of lives worldwide. So I think our community can be very, very proud of what we achieved in popularizing safer sex and getting people to adopt it, and thereby saving a lot of lives, not only in this country, but around the world.
Absolutely. Can we turn now to your activism? And I was just wondering, was there a pivotal moment for you as a young person that kind of turned you into the tremendous activist that you are?
Not really one single pivotal moment. You know, I realized I was gay and came out and began campaigning at the age of 17 in 1969. In my hometown of Melbourne, Australia, there were no LGBT groups, no counselling services, no helplines, nothing. I tried to set up an LGBT plus group, but everybody was too scared. So I just did things as a one-person band, you know, writing letters to newspapers and sometimes to members of parliament. But it was a thankless task because the level of homophobia was so great in that era. But the one thing I did find inspirational was the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. I can remember when I was 11 years old, I heard about the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 young girls about my own age were killed by white racists. I remember thinking to myself at the time, wow, just how shocking is that? You know, to kill any human being is wrong. 4 young girls in church on a Sunday morning. It really had a profound effect upon me, even though I was only 11 years old. And that inspired me to follow and support, from a distance, the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. So when I realized I was gay and wanted to campaign in 1969, this was just shortly after the Stonewall riots in New York, I didn't have an LGBT group to get involved with, I didn't have any knowledge of LGBT plus history. So what I did was, in my own sort of rather naive, immature mind, I reasoned that if black people were an oppressed minority deserving of equal rights, then so too were gay people. And I calculated that based on the history of the Black Civil Rights Movement, it would probably take about 50 years for LGBT plus people to win equal legal rights in countries like Australia, Britain, and the United States. That was a rough guesstimate, but it's almost turned out to be roughly true. So that's really how I began. But it wasn't until I came to London in 1971, aged 19, that I got involved in LGBT plus politics in the newly formed Gay Liberation Front. And of course, on Friday, the 27th of November, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the first ever LGBT plus protest in Britain, which took place in Highbury Fields, North London, against police harassment. You know, this is of course the 50th anniversary year of the formation of the Gay Liberation Front, which was founded at a meeting at the London School of Economics on the 13th of October 1970. So two big important anniversaries this year, the foundation of the Gay Liberation Front and the first ever LGBT plus protest in Britain.
Incredible. It must have been both exciting and terrifying to have been one of those founder members of the GLF. Can you tell us a bit about that first Pride March, how that was?
Well, just let me say that I was not at the first Gay Liberation Front meeting. That I arrived in Britain some months later. But I did get very involved. I mean, I think on the second day I arrived in London, I saw a sticker advertising the Gay Liberation Front on a lamppost near Oxford Street. And within 5 days, I was at my first Gay Liberation Front meeting. And within a month, I was helping to organise many of the spectacular protests that GLF did back then. Certainly, LGBT plus activism in those days was much more difficult than now. First of all, public attitudes were much more hostile. We had a really intense level of police harassment and victimization. In fact, in the years after the partial decriminalization of male homosexuality in 1967, the number of gay and bisexual men arrested for consenting same-sex behavior actually rose by several hundred%. So the police actually got more repressive after the law reform of 1967. It's really something that a lot of people don't realize. I remember it well. And lots of my friends were arrested for behavior that would not be a crime between heterosexual men and women. Yeah. And that criminalization continued. I mean, it's only since 2003 that we have had a criminal code in England and Wales that does not discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. Up until that year, the buggery law passed in 1533 during the reign of King Henry VIII remained on statute books. The law against gross indecency, which sent Oscar Wilde to prison in 1895 and led to Alan Turing being ordered to subject himself to chemical castration in 1952, that law also remained on the statute books until 2003. So it's been a long, long, hard battle.
Mm. People don't realise how recent it was that we actually got some rights, do they?
Yeah. We're absolutely indebted to you and the other people involved at that time. Trailblazer is a term that's thrown around, but it doesn't even seem like enough. So thank you for that.
I just add that, sadly, most of the people involved in those campaigns are unsung and unknown. All the victories we've won have been the result of tens of thousands of LGBT plus people and straight friends and allies who marched with us. It's their collective effort that made the changes possible. It wasn't me or Outrage or Stonewall or anybody else. It's all of us together. United, we've been strong. Together, we've made those changes.
Yeah, and I think that continues to be a characteristic of the Pride movement across the globe, really. I think it's something that we can be very proud of even today. In terms of your activism, it's been quite a roller coaster. You've been arrested, attacked, you've had numerous death threats, you've had live bullets put through your letterbox. I mean, that must have been a heck of a lot to deal with, and you just never relented, did you? You just carried on with what you were doing with your head held high. I mean, how did you manage to do that?
Often with difficulty. I just had a passion that, we as LGBT plus people deserve respect, dignity, and equal rights, and that the people who are standing in our way had to be opposed. And I took inspiration from other human rights defenders, not just LGBT plus ones, but other human rights defenders, like the Black Civil Rights Movement in America, like the suffragettes who fought for votes for women. I thought, if they can do it, I should have a go. But it has been tough. I mean, I've been involved in over 3,000 protests over the last 53 years. I've been arrested about 100 times. I've been physically violently assaulted over 300 times. The number of death threats runs into the thousands, if not the tens of thousands, particularly in the 1990s during the outrage campaigns, which were very in your face and very challenging. I was a magnet for homophobes all over the country, indeed all over the world. So I had a lot of stick, and I've had all kinds of attempts to discredit me and smear me. It has been tough, but I've got a group of friends who've stood by me and supported me, and I've just sort of felt, well, I don't want the buggers to grind me down. I don't want them to win. So I've just picked myself up and carried on. But it has been difficult. I've had a bit of brain damage from the bashings by President Mugabe's thugs in Brussels in 2001, and again from neo-Nazis in Moscow in 2007. So it's made things a bit difficult. My memory is a bit affected. I've got problems sometimes with coordination, balance, and concentration. But I'm slower, but I keep on going. I'm sort of I'm the Duracell activist. I go on and on and on.
Well, your grit and determination has stayed with you. It's obviously keeping you going. We have a 15-year-old daughter, and she's actually a youth ambassador for Pride in Surrey. In terms of young people, what advice would you give to them in terms of activism and how they can get involved? Well,
obviously, we have to pass the baton to younger and future generations. I'm getting on, and lots of my colleagues from back in the early 70s or late 60s, they're getting on as well, and some, of course, sadly even passed away. So it really is important that young people step up to the mark, and it's really great that they are doing so. And I'm really inspired by their enthusiasm and their new style of activism. A lot more of online activism, a lot more social media activism. It's all very, very important and adds to the mix. It's clear that we do have battles still to fight and win, such as securing the long overdue reform of the Gender Recognition Act to give trans people the right to self-identify by a statutory declaration, as exists in other countries without a problem. We also need to ensure that the LGBT plus inclusive education that's now mandatory in schools, that it actually has quality content, that isn't just a token tick boxing, that actually young LGBT kids and their straight friends and allies get that information and get quality information to affirm their identity, to protect them against bullying and hate crime. We also need to keep on insisting that the government has got to stop the discrimination against LGBT plus asylum seekers and refugees. It's shocking that many of them are detained in detention centres, which are really glorified prisons by another name, and that the rate of refusal is so astronomically high, much higher than for political, economic, or ethnic or other people fleeing persecution. It really is unconscionable that people have often been imprisoned or tortured or fled mob violence come here and get detained like common criminals. And on top of that, of course, with the high refusal rate, it means that some LGBT plus refugees end up being sent back to countries where their lives and liberty is at risk. We also need to step up the campaign to ensure compensation for gay or bisexual men who were convicted under historic anti-gay laws. Many of these men not only suffered the stigma of a criminal conviction, some were jailed, many were fined, some as a result lost their job, lost their marriage, lost their home, found difficulty in getting a new job because they had a criminal conviction. These men deserve compensation. And it's shocking that neither Theresa May's government nor Boris Johnson's government has been willing to consider that. So they're just few examples of what needs to be done. It's great that young people are stepping up and continuing the battle, the long, hard battle that people like myself initiated. You know, I really, really support young people, and I'm so inspired and encouraged by them.
Yeah, us too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just touching on what you said there about governments, do you think the alarming rise of the right-wing agenda, both here and across the world, will lead to a reversal of our human rights?
Certainly, we need to be vigilant. You know, I don't think we should ever assume that the rights and freedoms won are here to stay. They could potentially be reversed. Now, I can't imagine how that might happen. You know, right now it seems inconceivable, but who knows what might happen in 10, 20 or 30 years' time if we had runaway climate destruction and the economic devastation that would ensue from that, or if we had another repeat on an even bigger scale of the 2008 financial crash. It's quite possible that far-right groups could emerge who would promise to fix things, who would demand strong government, who would say that for the sake of solving the problem, these groups have to be held in check. You know, that has historically been the way in which the far right operates. You know, they've targeted Jews, gay, LGBTs, black and ethnic minority people, and so on. So we do need to be vigilant.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. It's worrying times.
Certainly is. You go ahead.
Do you feel that the fact that there have been peaceful protests that have been shut down, you know, under the guise of COVID safety, should be a serious concern for us going forward with our right to protest in this country?
Well, I think, you know, civil liberties have to be jealously guarded. Governments always want to find some way to strengthen their power and undermine the power of the citizen. And often they will give good excuses, but sometimes those excuses turn out to be flawed. So I'm thinking of the 1986 Public Order Act, which was originally introduced to target football hooligans and street riots. But very soon afterwards, it has become primarily used to suppress legitimate peaceful protests. Now, of course, not all peaceful protests are suppressed using this law, but you know, many have been. So, for example, I can remember some years ago, quite a few years ago, in fact, working with Zimbabwean exiles and human rights defenders to protest against President Mandela of South Africa over his failure to speak out against the Mugabe tyranny. And we wanted to hold a peaceful picket as he attended an event in Hyde Park. And the police would not allow us anywhere near, you know, and in fact, even though we were a long way from where his motorcade would go, when his motorcade approached, the police stood in front of us so Mandela could not see our placards. Now that's an example of how the Public Order Act can be and has been abused. So with COVID, we need to be very, very sure that the restrictions are necessary and proportionate. I mean, I don't think there should be a blanket ban on all protests, but I do think that all protests should be with face masks and with proper social distancing. Sadly, that doesn't often happen. And that's the problem. You know, if people protesting won't abide by the rules, and I'm not saying that I'm a great defender of rules, but you know, the rules are there to protect people. You know, abiding by the rules is designed to protect your health and the health of others around you. You know, I think if people won't do that, then you know, it's giving the government the ammunition they need to restrict our civil rights and liberties, and that's very sad. I've been on a couple of protests where we did stick to the rules. I mean, the 27th of June Pride in London march was cancelled because of, but myself and other veterans of the Gay Liberation Front organised a small face mask wearing, socially distanced Pride March, where we did abide by the rules. I mean, I think maybe a couple of people sort of strayed a bit, but we did abide by the rules, and I think that was fair and proper. And we were not arrested. The police were there, but they said that they understood and saw that we were 99% of the time complying with the rules, so they didn't feel any need to intervene. But I've also seen many other protests where people have not worn face masks or not socially distanced, and that is very foolish, because this is a very dangerous pandemic which can kill people. And for our own sakes and the sakes of the people around us who we care about, and indeed for the wider society, we do need to take precautions. We need to protect each other.
I think the concern is that, protest could be hindered going forward for many years under the guise of no huge public gatherings. And, we've seen some huge turnouts in London recently over issues such as Brexit and things like that. And it does worry the government, and it's just an excuse for them to be able to shut us up, really, isn't it? Saying no public gatherings.
Yeah, I think that sometimes the government's approach seems to be more motivated by a political agenda and a desire to go beyond what is proportionate and necessary. The government has been overcautious in some of the instances, and I think that as I said, providing face masks are worn and providing social distancing is maintained, I don't see any reason why there shouldn't be protests.
We see when we can all get back out there wearing our face masks. Surrey Pride as an organisation, we are in our infancy. We're only a couple of years old. Unfortunately, C19 put a stop to our second ever Pride Festival. We are a daily ongoing concern. We're not just once a year party people. We provide services and content for people all year round under the guise of this, our Not Alone programme. Do you think Pride movements such as ourselves are still relevant and necessary in the UK today?
Well, for as long as there is homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, we will need Pride. Pride is necessary because we don't have full dignity, respect and rights. And, it's really, really important that we have Pride events rooted like yours in local communities. It's great to have big mega prides like London, Manchester, Birmingham and Brighton, but we also need to have those local grassroots Pride events as well, where LGBT plus people are seen in their own local communities, and where local authorities and community groups engage with those Pride committees, and where those Pride committees can do the kind of work that you're doing locally as well. Outreach to schools, working with health authorities and STI clinics, engaging with local councils. These are all very, very important things to ensure that everywhere across Britain, LGBT plus people can live happy, fulfilled lives.
Representation everywhere.
Absolutely.
Certainly what we aim to do. Right, we're almost at the end now, Peter, you'll be relieved to know. So this interview will be shown across our social media channels, but we also have a radio show which airs on Trans Radio UK and Radio Woking. Is there a song that you would like us to play on your behalf, Peter?
You got me there. I think probably John Lennon's Imagine.
Oh, yes, lovely.
Perfect.
That's, for me, encapsulates my values and issues that are dear to my heart. I want a world without war and conflict. I want a world where we can all live in peace. I want a world where religion has no privileges and doesn't oppress and persecute people because of ancient dogmas. That song really is the anthem of my human rights work.
Wonderful.
Perfect. We will make sure we get that played for you. But thank you so much for speaking to us today, Peter. It's been a privilege and an honour and a pleasure. So we really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And it's been an honour to join you. And I want to again pay tribute to the work you do in Surrey. local organizations, as I said, are so important. And it's really great that you are doing this work. And I want to thank all your members, volunteers, and supporters. Keep up the great work that you do. You're much valued, much appreciated, and you have helped make this country change. You've helped bring about these changes. You are continuing to work for those changes. And I'm so proud and honored to have been able to engage with you today.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Peter.